I always thought family dinners were supposed to be normal, a familiar part of my relationship with my boyfriend. We had been together for over 2.5 years, and even though I knew his parents didn't fully approve of me, my relationship with them had always been fairly cordial. I had learned to smile, nod at the right moments, and stay silent in the face of sharp remarks or judging glances. Sometimes I even had to force a small smile just to keep things smooth. But tonight, I felt something different in the air, a strange sensation. Like the atmosphere in their house could shift at any moment. We walked into their home, a place I knew well but that always felt a little suffocating. The faint scent of his mother's perfume mixed with the aroma of food from the kitchen, along with the cheerful laughter of his sister and the small pitter-patter of his little niece, created a warm yet subtly tense atmosphere. I smiled, trying to stay calm, but my heart was racing. I told myself, just stay quiet. Everything will be fine. The evening started with small talk, work updates, recent trips, even a few harmless jokes about the weather. I tried to join in naturally, but I felt like an outsider, simply observing. Everyone else laughed and talked effortlessly, while I kept watch on every glance, every gesture. My boyfriend seemed relaxed, engaging smoothly, smiling lightly at his mother and sister. I looked at him, seeing him as a bridge, but also realizing the invisible gap between me and his family. Suddenly, his sister, with a curious tone, asked, "Mum, you've never told us how you and Dad met, have you?" A brief hush fell over the room. I immediately sensed that a story was about to unfold, a story that I knew would change the atmosphere. I turned to his mother and saw her smile, her eyes lighting up as if preparing to tell a particularly juicy tale. I took a small breath, telling myself, it's just a story about how they met, nothing serious. But as soon as she started, I realized I was wrong. Her voice was playful, tinged with pride over a past only she found amusing, how she met my boyfriend's father, the tense situations at work, affairs, harassment, and even threats. My heart began to race, my body tense. I tried to suppress my disgust, to keep a neutral expression, but every detail struck at my deepest moral values. His sister giggled. His little niece raised her eyebrows in innocent curiosity, and my boyfriend looked at his mother with a mix of surprise and familiarities, if he had heard this story countless times and thought it perfectly normal. I sat there, quietly, my heart pounding, feeling shock, revulsion, and confusion all at once. I wondered, how can everyone find this funny when it's full of manipulation, harassment, and threats? I looked down at the table, telling myself it was just the past, but deep down, I knew I could not accept it. If I stayed silent, I'd be complicit in normalizing abuse. The pressure weighed on my wanted to maintain peace, but I also had to speak up. I knew, in that moment, that my reaction would forever change the dinner. His mother continued, laughing softly as she recounted how she destroyed the ex-fiancé's wedding dress as a prank, how his father threatened her with compromising photos, and the ultimate decision to marry anyway. She told it like a joke, but to me, each word was a string of abuse painted as humor. I held my breath, feeling the air thicken around me. I searched for my boyfriend's eyes, hoping he would understand my feelings, but he just smiled faintly, unaware of the gravity I felt. I took a deep breath, a heat running down my spine, my body ready to react. Finally, I spoke, my voice firm but not loud. This story is genuinely disturbing and abusive. I can't see this as funny. For a moment, silence fell. His mother's smile vanished, her brows knitting together. His sister stared wide-eyed. His little niece tilted her head in curiosity. My boyfriend turned to me, slightly flustered, saying I was being too dramatic. But in my heart, I knew I had done the right thing. I could not let a story filled with abuse be treated as humor. The rest of the dinner was cold. His mother barely spoke, her gaze turned elsewhere. His sister and niece tried to lighten the mood with small jokes. But the distance had already formed between me and them, between my values and how they perceived the past. I sat quietly, nibbling at my food, my mind a whirlwind. I realized that in every family, invisible boundaries exist, and sometimes standing up for your principles can make you feel like a stranger in a familiar dinner. Every passing minute seemed stretched. Each laugh, each casual comment felt like a needle pricking at my self-respect and values. I closed my eyes briefly, took a deep breath, reminding myself that I was there not just for myself, but for the principles I believed in. A part of me wanted to leave immediately. Another part held me there, knowing that running away would never make me feel right. The warm light of the dining room cast reflections across their faces, mirroring contrasting emotions, the humor in his mother's eyes, the curiosity in his sisters, the innocence in his nieces, and the helpless, isolated feeling in mine. I reminded myself that this dinner would stay with me, not just because of the initial shock, but because of the power struggle of moral values. And for the first time, I realized I had to stand my ground in someone else's family. After my initial reaction, the atmosphere at the table shifted immediately. My boyfriend's mother stopped laughing, her gaze turned cold, and her lips pressed together as if calculating something. His sister looked at me with a mix of shock and disbelief. His little niece remained curious but didn't fully understand. And my boyfriend seemed flustered, trying to say something to break the tension, but it was clear he didn't know what to do. I took a deep breath, telling myself I needed to hear the full story and understand everything before deciding how to respond. His mother began, recounting her past in greater detail, her voice still tinged with humor, but the content made me shiver. She explained that when she was younger, she had been his father's subordinate at work, and he had constantly harassed her, ranging from inappropriate comments and invasive looks to subtle threats that left her feeling unsafe. As I listened to these details, my chest tightened and my body stiffened. This wasn't just an old story. It was emotional abuse, and yet everyone else seemed to treat it lightly. She continued, explaining the forbidden affair that followed, the cheating, the emotional blackmail, and how he used compromising photos to coerce her. His sister giggled, treating the story like harmless gossip, while I felt an overwhelming revulsion. I closed my eyes briefly, took a slow breath, but my body remained tense. I realized that if I stayed silent, I would be complicit in turning abuse into a joke hand that was unacceptable to me. What shocked me even more was her story about the ex-fiancé's wedding dress, which she had destroyed as a prank. Everyone laughed as if it were a humorous anecdote, but to me it was an act of vengeance and emotional violence, not something funny. My hands trembled slightly, my heartbeat quickened. I couldn't comprehend how anyone could laugh at revenge and abuse. I looked down at my plate, trying to contain my anger and remind myself, I have to stay calm. But I cannot remain silent. I turned to my boyfriend, hoping he would understand how I felt. But he just gave a tight-lipped smile and said I was being dramatic and that everyone was just laughing. Those words hit me like a punch to the gut. I realized there was a values gap between us. He viewed this as a funny story, while I saw abuse and coercion. I felt torn between wanting to explain, wanting to flee the room, and wanting to stand my ground. I took another deep breath and said firmly, "Mom, I can't see this as funny. This is genuinely disturbing and abusive. If I ever have children, I definitely don't want them to hear a story like this." The moment stretched painfully long. My boyfriend's mother turned away, her gaze cold, her smile gone. His sister froze, and my boyfriend looked at me, confused and unsure how to intervene. The heavy silence enveloped the room, but I felt a sense of relief I had stood up for my values. The dinner continued, but the laughter and easy conversation were gone. Everyone spoke carefully, cautiously, as if afraid to touch the wounds of the past. I observed every detail, the way his mother gripped her utensils, his sister avoiding my eyes, the innocence of his niece but the occasional questioning glance toward me, and my boyfriend's discomfort. Every gesture, every glance highlighted the stark contrast in values between me and his family. Inside, I felt a mixture of isolation and resolve. I reminded myself that sometimes standing up for your beliefs and personal boundaries makes you the outsider. In familiar settings, but it's necessary. I reflected on the small slights and subtle jokes from the past that I had tolerated quietly. Now I understood. My limits had been crossed, and I could not remain silent any longer. His mother then went deeper into the story. The intricate threats, how she navigated his coercion while protecting herself, and the difficult decisions leading to their eventual marriage. Listening, my chest tightened further. I felt sorrow for her, yet disgust at the actions being treated lightly. Each detail heightened the tension in the room and escalated my internal conflict. I felt a whirlwind of emotions: disgust, anger, confusion, and a strange hint of empathy. I wanted to speak more, to analyze, to explain why this was abuse and not a joke, but I feared intensifying the conflict. I realized I was trapped between two worlds, my moral code and emotional integrity versus my love for my boyfriend and maintaining family harmony. Time seemed to stretch unnaturally. Each word, each gesture, etched the divide deeper. I closed my eyes briefly, took a deep breath, reminding myself to stay firm, not letting emotion take over. I looked at the ceiling, light reflecting off everyone's faces, the forced smile of his mother, the curiosity in his sister's eyes, the innocence of his niece, and the tension in my own expression. Every detail painted a different reality, where perspectives and emotions collided. As the dinner finally ended, the tension lingered. His mother barely spoke, picking at her food, avoiding my gaze. His sister and niece tried to lighten the mood with small jokes, but the distance was clear. I sat quietly, picking at my plate, feeling both alone and resolute. Knowing I had stood for my principles, I realized something important. Sometimes, maintaining your values in an environment where ethics and perceptions differ can make you feel like a stranger in a familiar space, but it's the only way to avoid losing yourself. Tonight, I had learned this lesson deeply, firsthand, right in my boyfriend's family kitchen. After the first confrontation at the table, the atmosphere didn't just feel heavy, it felt almost suffocating, like an invisible weight pressing down on every breath. The clinking of forks and knives, the faint tapping of glasses, even the sound of breathing seemed amplified, turning the dining room into a tense, fragile stage. I tried to sip my soup, but the flavors had completely disappeared under the intensity of the moment. Every story my boyfriend's mother had just shared wrapped around my mind like invisible cords, dragging me into a whirlwind of disgust, shock, and anxiety. My body tensed, my heart raced, but at the same time, a small voice of determination and reason stirred deep inside me. I scanned the room, taking in every detail. The soft yellow light from the chandelier reflected off the polished table, casting blurred shadows across everyone's faces. My boyfriend's mother's smile had vanished, replaced by a tight-lipped, calculating look, her eyes cold and sharp. His sister pressed her lips together, avoiding my gaze, while his little niece frowned slightly, curiosity and unease flickering across her face. Everything felt like it was shrinking around me, compressing me into the center of a storm, making me feel simultaneously isolated and resolute. In my mind, I replayed every part of her story, the subtle harassment, the forbidden affair, the threats, the revenge involving the wedding dress. Each memory carved itself into my consciousness, making me recoil with horror and intensifying the sense that abuse was being normalized and laughing at it was unacceptable. I realized that if I stayed silent, I would be complicit. I couldn't allow that. I looked at my boyfriend, hoping for understanding, for some acknowledgement that he saw the gravity of the situation. Instead, he looked torn, awkward, unsure how to respond. He finally muttered, attempting to diffuse the tension, "Come on. Don't take it so seriously. Everyone's just joking." His words felt like a punch to my chest. I could feel my calm shattering. I knew that remaining quiet would betray my principles. My heart pounded, my hands trembled slightly, but I inhaled deeply and spoke, my voice firm. "You know, I can't see this as funny. What your mum described, the abuse, the threats, the coercion, that's not a joke. Can't you see the difference?" The room seemed to freeze. His mother's eyes narrowed, her face hardening like steel. His sister turned away, pursing her lips. His little niece lowered her gaze, unsure but sensing the tension. My boyfriend stood frozen, caught between two worlds, his family and his girlfriend, reason and emotion. I felt an overwhelming mixture of loneliness and resolve, as if I was standing apart yet stronger than ever before. After a tense pause, his mother spoke, her tone sharp, a trace of anger lacing her words. "You think you have the right to judge my past. That was almost 30 years ago, and he's been my husband for decades. You're making too much of this." I inhaled slowly, steadying my voice, and met her gaze. "Yes, I know it happened a long time ago, but that doesn't make it any less harmful or abusive. I'm only saying that if I ever have children, I wouldn't want them to hear this story and think that violence and manipulation are funny." The room hung in a tense silence. Every movement seemed deliberate, cautious. I watched small gestures, the way she set her spoon down, slightly trembling. His sister's tightened lips and averted eyes. His niece's quiet, puzzled stare. My boyfriend exhaled, eyes flickering with frustration and uncertainty. I realized that if I stayed silent, I'd feel powerless and complicit. A quiet determination rose within me. I spoke again, louder, so the entire table could hear. "This isn't a normal story to laugh at. It's abuse, harassment, and intimidation. I cannot accept treating it like a joke. Do you hear me?" It was like dropping a stone into a still pond. The tension rippled outward. His mother closed her eyes briefly, shoulders tensing. His sister lowered her gaze, silent. My boyfriend ground his teeth, his expression a mix of anger and bewilderment. I felt the weight of the room pressing down, but at the same time, A sense of inner strength and resolve surged, something I had never experienced so vividly. I closed my eyes for a moment, inhaling deeply, forcing my heartbeat to steady. I thought back on the smaller moments I had tolerated in the past, snide comments, judging glances, subtle jokes at my expense. But tonight was different. I realized my boundaries had been crossed, and if I didn't speak up, I would lose myself. Finally, my boyfriend spoke, his voice shaky, tinged with frustration. "Look, I love you, but you're taking this way too seriously. It's in the past, and my mum told it in a way she finds funny. You can't just see it through your lens." I met his gaze, feeling a mix of sadness, anger, and desperation. "You can love me, but you also need to recognize that some boundaries cannot be crossed. What your mum described was abuse, and I can't stay silent. You may stay where you are, but I have to stand up." The table fell into a prolonged silence, as if the room itself were holding its breath. I could feel an invisible wall forming between me and them. Everyone spoke cautiously, reluctant to break the stillness, yet unwilling to accept my viewpoint. His niece looked at me with wide, curious eyes, sensing the seriousness. His sister kept her head down, lips pressed tight. His mother drew a long breath, battling her own emotions. As the dinner ended, everyone rose and moved toward the living room. The tension remained, but I felt I had stood my ground. I closed my eyes briefly, inhaled deeply, and reminded myself, sometimes, standing up for what you believe in can change how people see you. But the most important thing is not losing yourself. I stepped out into the backyard, letting the cool evening air fill my lungs, eyes tracing the star-filled sky. Relief and tension intermingled within me. I thought I did the right thing. Even if they don't understand, I cannot allow abuse to be treated as a joke. The gentle night breeze brushed my hair, washing away some of the pressure, while also reminding me that more challenges were yet to come. Deep inside, I realized something profound. In love and in life, personal boundaries and values cannot be compromised. Tonight, I had learned to stand firm in the face of emotional storms, even when standing alone. After that tense dinner, my boyfriend's apartment felt eerily quiet. There was no laughter, no cheerful chatter, only a heavy, oppressive silence, as if even the walls were sighing. I sat on the sofa, hugging a pillow, staring blankly out the window, still weighed down by a lingering sense of exhaustion and helplessness. My heart was still racing from what had happened, but at the same time, a strange feeling stirred inside me. I had stood up for myself, and that both terrified and empowered me. My boyfriend sat beside me, an invisible chasm separating us. He didn't reach for my hand, and he avoided my eyes. After a long pause, he exhaled deeply, his voice low. "Look, I know you're upset and tense, but tonight, I felt like you made everything worse." I turned to him, my eyes still damp from tension, but my voice steady. "Your feelings are yours. But can't you see that I couldn't stay silent when I heard violence being treated like a joke?" He remained silent, head bowed, clearly wrestling with himself. I knew he loved me, yet he was caught in a conflict between his feelings for me and his loyalty to his family. It hurt. I felt both compassion and frustration that someone I loved couldn't understand that my values and boundaries were non-negotiable. The silence stretched on, broken only by the faint ticking of a clock. I reminded myself to stay patient, to remain calm, or else things would spiral out of control. I inhaled deeply and said, gently but firmly, You can't love me and expect me to stay quiet about what I believe is right. If that makes you uncomfortable, you need to reflect on your feelings instead of blaming me." His eyes flickered with understanding, yet uncertainty and fear lingered. I realized this was a turning point in our relationship, where both of us had to confront differences in values and perspectives. It felt like I was walking a tightrope between love and self-respect, between tolerance and speaking up, between a long-term relationship and honesty with myself. After several moments, he spoke, his voice shaky and tinged with frustration. "I know you're right, but I feel like you attacked my family. You made my mum upset, and I don't know how to make it okay." I drew in a deep breath, controlling my emotions. I understood he was speaking from the heart, but he was confusing standing up for what's right with attacking someone personally. I said softly but firmly, "You need to understand that speaking the truth isn't attacking anyone. I'm not attacking your mum, I just cannot accept that abuse is treated like a joke. You can stand with me, or you can't, but I won't compromise on this." A flicker of comprehension passed through his eyes, mingled with lingering pain. I realized that our relationship was being tested, not just emotionally, but morally, challenging boundaries, values, and honesty. Over the next few days, the tension persisted. I kept my distance from his mother, and every time I thought about that dinner, a wave of suffocating frustration and anger rose within me. I had to keep reminding myself I had done the right thing, and I couldn't compromise on my principles. My boyfriend called and texted multiple times, trying to explain that his mother was hurt and didn't understand why I had reacted so strongly. I listened, but I maintained my stance. I knew that my firmness would determine the future of our relationship, and if he couldn't accept it, we would face even harder choices ahead. My mind also kept analyzing the situation. If his mother didn't change, if his family continued to treat abusive stories as jokes, could I truly live in that environment? The thought was both calmly rational and emotionally draining, making me realize how much I had grown and that I would never compromise my core values. That night, I sat by the window, looking out at the city lights, reminding myself, love isn't just about happy moments. It's also about facing challenges that reveal boundaries, values, and inner strength. And I knew that, come storm or calm, I had learned to stand firm, protect myself, and prepare for the next steps in this relationship. In the days following that tense dinner, my boyfriend's apartment no longer felt warm or familiar. There was no laughter, no gentle chatter, only an invisible, heavy silence that seemed to press down on everything. Every step he took, every gesture he made, felt measured, calculated. I wondered if the relationship we had spent 2.5 years building was now facing its most serious crisis. He tried to approach me, but his eyes kept avoiding mine, his voice low and hesitant. One evening, as we sat down for dinner together, he said something that startled me. "You know, my mum still hasn't forgiven you. She says you're too sensitive. And honestly, I feel a little exhausted too." I closed my eyes, feeling the wave of frustration and helplessness rise like a slow-burning fire in my chest. I replied, trying to stay calm, "You may feel exhausted, but that doesn't change the truth. I can't stay silent when I hear stories of abuse being treated like jokes. If you love me, you have to understand that." He bowed his head and stayed silent. I knew he loved me, but at the same time, he was caught between his feelings for me and the pressure from his family, like a boat trapped between two powerful currents. My chest ached. How could someone I loved so much not see the boundaries and core values I had established? The silence stretched on, broken only by the steady ticking of the clock. I reminded myself to be patient, to breathe deeply, and to stay calm. Everything would spiral out of control. Finally, I spoke. You can't love me and also expect me to stay quiet about what I believe is right. If this makes you uncomfortable, you need to examine your feelings instead of blaming me. A flicker of comprehension passed through his eyes, but uncertainty and fear still lingered. I realized this was a turning point in our relationship, where we both had to confront differences in values and perspectives. I could feel myself walking a tightrope between love and self-respect, between tolerance and speaking up, between long-term commitment and honesty with myself. A few days later, his mother called. Her voice was cold and reproachful. You think you have the right to speak up just because of how you feel. Our family doesn't need anyone lecturing us. I inhaled deeply, trying to keep my voice calm. You don't understand. I'm not lecturing anyone. I'm just expressing my feelings. If I stayed silent, I would feel like I was betraying myself. The call ended, leaving me with a strange mix of isolation and determination. I knew I couldn't change their perspective overnight, but I could protect myself and my values. The tension only increased during family gatherings. Every time I faced his mother and sister, I felt their scrutinizing, cautious eyes, as if I were walking on a tightrope that could snap at any moment. One evening, during a family gathering, his mother told another old story in a humorous tone. I felt overwhelming tension and frustration building up inside me. I sighed and spoke up. I'm sorry, but I can't see that as funny. It's part of a story about abuse and mental pressure, and I can't treat it lightly. Everyone fell silent. His mother's eyes flashed with anger, his sister lowered her gaze, and my boyfriend's eyes widened, half confused, half afraid. This time, I wasn't just standing up for myself. I was setting a clear boundary, showing everyone that I would not accept abuse being normalized. My boyfriend began having private conversations with me. He was anxious, sometimes frustrated, but also struggled to articulate his feelings. You know, I love you, but sometimes it feels like you're against my whole family. I don't want to lose you, but I also don't want to make my mom upset. I looked at him, voice firm. You can't love me and simultaneously embrace values that conflict with what I believe is right. You have to choose, stand with me, or accept that the distance between us will grow. These conversations made me feel the maturity of my emotions, but also the heartache. Love isn't always happiness. It's also facing challenges that test your principles and integrity. One afternoon, I walked alone through familiar streets that now felt strangely distant and lonely. I thought about the future. If his family didn't change, if they continued to treat abuse as a joke, I would have to make difficult decisions. I realized that love alone isn't always enough to sustain a relationship. Principles, values, and self-respect often matter more. When I returned home, he was waiting in the living room. His head bowed, voice low. I know you're right. I want to try to understand and stand with you, but I still fear the tension between you and my family. I smiled faintly, though my heart was still tense. You don't need to understand everything immediately. What matters is that you recognize I cannot compromise. We can love each other, but we must respect one another and our individual values. The following weeks were still challenging. Every family gathering carried an invisible pressure. sometimes making me want to turn away and retreat. But I knew I couldn't. I had to stand firm, to show both him and myself that inner strength and honesty with oneself are key to surviving any challenge. That night, I sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker in the darkness, feeling the complexity of love and trials. I knew more difficulties lay ahead, but at least I had maintained my integrity, stood up for what I believed in, and prepared for the next steps, no matter how hard they might be. The weeks following that confrontation at dinner were still tense. Every interaction with my boyfriend carried an unspoken caution and anxiety. I realized that love isn't just about happy moments, it's also a constant challenge, forcing you to confront yourself. One late weekend afternoon, he invited me over to have an honest talk. As I stepped into the familiar living room, I noticed the worry and subtle exhaustion on his face. He let out a long sigh, his voice trembling slightly. "You know I love you, but it feels like everything is turning against us. I don't want to lose you, but my mum is still upset, and I'm just tired of all this tension." I took a deep breath, trying to steady my emotions. I knew he spoke from the heart, but his words still made me ache. "You may feel tired, but that doesn't change the truth. I cannot stay silent when I see things I believe are wrong. If you love me, you need to understand and stand with me, not pressure me to give in." He bowed his head, silent. I could see the deep internal struggle in his eyes, between love, family, responsibility, and personal feelings. I knew I was standing at a crucial crossroads. If he didn't align with me, the distance between us would only grow. A few days later, his mother called again. This time, her tone was less cold but still sharp. "You really think you can change anything? Our family doesn't need anyone standing up to teach us." I kept my voice calm. "You don't need to change, but I cannot compromise my principles and values. I'm not lecturing anyone in protecting myself and what I believe is right." After the call, I felt a mix of isolation and newfound strength. I realized that in any relationship, you cannot sacrifice your core values just to please others. Tension escalated further during a family gathering. Every glance, every whispered comment, and every subtle look from his mother and sister made me feel an invisible pressure pressing down. When his mother told another old story with a light-hearted tone, I felt anger and frustration rise. I took a deep breath and spoke. "I'm sorry, but I can't see that as funny. It involves abuse and emotional pressure, and I cannot take it lightly." The room fell silent. His mother's eyes flashed with anger, his sister looked down, and my boyfriend seemed both confused and fearful. I felt my inner strength surge. This time, I wasn't just standing up for myself, I was drawing a clear boundary, showing that I would not accept abuse being normalized. After the gathering, my boyfriend pulled me onto the balcony for a private conversation. He exhaled heavily. "You know I love you, but sometimes it feels like you're against my whole family. I don't want to lose you, but I also fear the ongoing conflict between you and my mother." I looked directly at him, voice firm. "You cannot love me while tolerating values that conflict with what I believe is right. You have to choose, stand with me, or accept that the distance between us will grow." He remained silent, a battle of emotions in his eyes, yet there was also a glimmer of hope. I realized that love sometimes forces us to face the hardest choices in life. Hold on to affection or protect your integrity. Another afternoon, I walked alone along familiar streets. The city sparkled with lights, yet I felt strangely distant and alone. I thought about the future. If his family didn't change, if they continued treating abuse as a joke, I would have to make tough decisions. I realized that love alone is not always enough to sustain a relationship. Principles, integrity, and self-respect often matter more. When I returned home, he was waiting in the living room, head bowed. "I know you're right. I want to try to understand and stand with you, but I still fear the tension between you and my family will never end." I smiled faintly, though tension lingered in my chest. "You don't have to understand everything immediately. What matters is that you realize I cannot compromise. We can love each other, but we must respect one another and our individual values." The following weeks remained challenging. Every family gathering carried an invisible weight, sometimes making me want to retreat. But I knew I couldn't. I had to stand firm, showing both him and myself that inner strength and honesty with oneself are key to overcoming every challenge. That night, I sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker, feeling the complexity of love and trials. I knew more challenges lay ahead, but at least I had maintained my integrity, stood up for what I believed in, and prepared for the next steps, no matter how difficult they might be. Part 6 ends with a sense of tension yet determination. Love still exists, but conflicts, challenges, and personal values remain on the table. I realized that inner strength and staying true to oneself would be essential for navigating the trials to come. In the weeks that followed, the atmosphere between my boyfriend and me grew heavier than ever. Every family gathering felt charged with an unspoken tension, as if the smallest gesture could ignite a storm. I realized that our relationship was facing a make-or-break challenge, and I had to decide whether I had the strength to keep going. One evening, he invited me over for dinner. As I entered the living room, I noticed his mother's eyes flicker with a hint of sarcasm, and his sister wore that same scrutinizing smile. I sat down, trying to remain calm, sipping my tea as a way to ground myself. But within minutes, his mother began telling another old story, this time about a work conflict she had with a colleague, in a humorous tone. I felt a slow-burning anger rise inside me, yet I forced myself to stay composed. My boyfriend glanced at me, eyes full of worry and awkwardness. I could see he wanted to intervene, but he also feared his mother's reaction. I felt a deep divide. He was torn between me and his family, unsure how to bridge the gap. Finally, when his mother finished the story, I exhaled and said, "I'm sorry, but I can't see that as funny. It involves emotional abuse and pressure that I cannot take lightly." The room fell silent. His mother's eyes flashed with anger. His sister looked down, and my boyfriend bowed his head, half ashamed, half afraid. I felt a surge of inner strength, and this time, I wasn't just standing up for myself, for I was drawing a firm boundary. After dinner, we stepped onto the balcony for a private conversation. He sighed heavily. "You know I love you, but sometimes it feels like you're against my whole family. I don't want to lose you, but I also don't want to make my mom upset." I looked directly at him, voice steady. "You cannot love me while tolerating values that contradict what I believe is right. You have to choose. Stand with me or accept that the distance between us will grow." He remained silent, a storm of emotions in his eyes, but also a glimmer of hope. I realized that love sometimes forces you to face the hardest choices of your life. Hold on to affection or protect your integrity. The next day, I went for a walk alone, seeking clarity and calm. The city sparkled with lights, but inside, I felt strangely empty and alone. I thought about the past weeks, the arguments, love, and values I could not compromise. I reminded myself that if his family didn't change, I would have to make a firm, life-altering decision. When I returned, he was waiting in the living room, head bowed, voice low. "I know you're right. I want to try to understand and stand with you, but I still fear the conflict between you and my family will never end." I gave a faint smile, though tension lingered in my chest. "You don't have to understand everything immediately. What matters is that you realize I cannot compromise. We can love each other, but we must respect one another and our individual values." The following weeks remained challenging. Every family gathering carried an invisible weight, sometimes tempting me to retreat, but I knew I couldn't. I had to stand firm, showing both him and myself that inner strength and honesty with oneself are key to overcoming any challenge. During another gathering, his mother spoke unexpectedly, voice low. "You don't understand why she's so sensitive. It happened so long ago, doesn't matter anymore." I looked directly at her, voice firm. "Even if it was long ago, it still reflects how people treat each other. I cannot see it as a joke, and I cannot accept normalizing abuse." Silence fell. The tension was so thick, I could hear my own heart pounding. I realized at this time I wasn't just standing up for myself, I was upholding the principles I believe in. That night, I sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker, feeling the complexity of love, conflict, and challenge. I knew more difficulties lay ahead, but at least I had maintained my integrity, stood up for what I believed in, and prepared for the next steps, no matter how difficult. In the weeks following those intense confrontations, the atmosphere between my boyfriend's family and me grew heavier than ever. Every interaction felt loaded with scrutinizing eyes, half smiles, and veiled remarks, as if one wrong step could shatter the fragile barrier between me and them. One Saturday evening, he invited me over to try to normalize things. As I stepped into the familiar living room, the sense of familiarity was completely gone. His mother sat there, eyes filled with suspicion, and his sister wore that same appraising smile, as if waiting for me to say or do something wrong. I took a deep breath, trying to remain calm, but every laugh, every sentence, every glance made my heart race. Dinner began with old stories, this time about my boyfriend's childhood memories. Everyone laughed, yet I felt a hollow imitation of joy, like a curtain masking old wounds. I tried to sip my soup slowly, telling myself I needed to stay composed, to blend in without sparking an argument. Then his mother started recounting an old conflict she had with his father, her tone laced with humor, as if trying to turn past disputes into entertainment. I felt anger rising like a tide. I inhaled deeply, fighting back tears, and said, "I'm sorry, but I cannot see that as funny. It involves emotional pressure and wrongdoing, and I cannot take it lightly." The room went silent. His mother's eyes flashed with anger, his sister looked down, and my boyfriend stood there, his eyes a mix of fear and worry. I felt a surge of inner strength. This time, I wasn't just standing up for myself, I was asserting my principles and values. After dinner, we stepped out onto the balcony for a private conversation. He sighed heavily, voice low. "You know I love you, but sometimes it feels like you're against my whole family. I don't want to lose you, but I also don't want to make my mum upset." I looked directly at him, my tone firm. "You cannot love me while tolerating values that contradict what I believe is right. You have to choose. Stand with me, or accept that the distance between us will grow. He bowed his head, silent. I could see the storm of emotions in his eyes. This was the most crucial moment of our relationship. He didn't stand with me. I would have to make a decisive choice about our future. The next day, I went for a walk alone, seeking clarity and mental space. The familiar streets now felt distant, lights twinkling, yet inside I felt empty and alone. I thought about the past weeks, the arguments, love, and values I could not compromise. I realized that if his family didn't change, I would have to make a firm, life-altering decision. When I returned, he was waiting in the living room, head bowed, voice heavy. I know you're right. I want to try to understand and stand with you, but I still fear the conflict between you and my family will never end. I gave a faint smile, tension still tight in my chest. You don't need to understand everything immediately. What matters is that you realize I cannot compromise. We can love each other, but we must respect one another and our individual values. In the weeks that followed, every family gathering carried an invisible weight, sometimes tempting me to retreat. I wanted to run away, to avoid confrontation, but I knew I could not. I had to stay firm, showing him and myself that inner strength and honesty with oneself were key to overcoming every challenge at another gathering. His mother spoke unexpectedly, voice low. You don't understand why she's so sensitive. It happened so long ago, it doesn't matter anymore. I looked her in the eye, my tone unwavering. Even if it was long ago, it still reflects how people treat one another. I cannot see it as a joke, and I cannot accept normalizing abuse. Silence followed. The tension was so thick, I could hear my heart pounding. I realized that this time, I wasn't just defending myself, I was standing firmly for my principles and values. That night, I sat by the window, gazing at the city lights, feeling the complexity of love, conflict, and challenge. I knew more difficulties lay ahead, but at least I had remained true to myself, stood up for what I believed in, and prepared for the steps to come. No matter how hard, in that quiet moment, I felt courage rising within me, a deep, unshakable inner strength, and a clear determination that I would never abandon myself. Inner strength, honesty, and steadfastness were no longer abstract ideals. They had become my compass, guiding me forward through love, challenges, and the pressures that threatened to undermine everything I valued. Even as obstacles loomed, I knew I could face them, stand my ground, and protect both my love and my integrity. The weeks that followed were tense, with the atmosphere between me and my boyfriend's family stretched tight, like a rope on the verge of snapping. Every encounter carried an invisible pressure, as if every word, every gesture, was being silently judged. His mother's eyes still carried that scrutinizing edge, and his sister's smiles were laced with subtle mockery. I began to see that not only I, but my boyfriend, was trapped between two worlds, between love and family duty. One Friday evening, he invited me over. As I stepped into the living room, the familiar comfort was gone, replaced by a cold, underlying tension. We had just sat down when his mother started recounting another old story, about a former colleague and some workplace drama, her tone light and humorous, yet carrying a challenging undertone. My chest tightened, a mix of anger and lingering tension rising. I tried to sip my soup slowly, maintaining composure, but I could no longer hold back. I looked directly at his mother, my voice firm. I'm sorry, but I cannot see that as funny. I cannot accept turning experiences that caused harm into entertainment. The room fell silent. His sister glanced down, and my boyfriend stood there, nervous, eyes filled with worry. I felt inner strength surge within me this time. I wasn't just defending myself. I was drawing a clear boundary with his family. After dinner, we stepped out onto the balcony. He sighed deeply, his voice low. "You know I love you, but sometimes it feels like you're against my whole family. I don't want to lose you, but I also don't want to upset my mum." I looked him in the eye. "You cannot love me while tolerating values that contradict what I believe is right. You have to choose. Stand with me, or accept that the distance between us will grow." I saw the storm of emotions flicker in his eyes. This was the crucial moment. If he didn't stand by me, I would have to make a firm decision about our future. The next day, I went for a walk alone, seeking clarity and mental space. The familiar streets now felt foreign, lights twinkling, yet inside I felt empty and alone. I thought about everything, the arguments, the love, the values I could not compromise. I realized that if his family didn't change, I would have to carve my own path. When I returned, he was waiting in the living room, head bowed, voice heavy. "I know you're right. I want to try to stand by you, but I still fear the conflict between you and my family will never end." I smiled faintly, though tension still weighed on my chest. "You don't need to understand everything immediately. What matters is that you realize I cannot compromise. We can love each other, but we must respect one another and our values." In the following weeks, every family gathering carried an invisible weight, sometimes tempting me to retreat. I wanted to run, to avoid confrontation, but I knew I could not. I had to stand firm, showing him and myself that inner strength and honesty with oneself were key to overcoming every challenge. One evening, in a private moment, he took my hand. "I want to understand you better. I want to stand by you, but sometimes I feel overwhelmed. I'm afraid if I make the wrong move, I'll lose you." I looked into his eyes, voice steady but full of emotion. "You don't need to understand everything immediately. What matters is that you stand by me, that you respect the values I hold. Love isn't just a feeling, it's respect and choice." We fell silent, listening only to the wind sweeping past the balcony. In that moment, I felt a surge of courage, a deep, unshakable inner strength, and a determination that I would never abandon myself. I understood that love could make your heart race, but steadfastness, honesty, and courage were what would determine whether this relationship could endure. That night, I sat by the window, gazing at the city lights, feeling the complexity of love, conflict, and responsibility. I knew more challenges lay ahead, but at least I had remained true to myself, stood up for what I believed in, and prepared for the next steps, no matter how difficult. Inner strength, honesty, and perseverance had become my compass, guiding me through love, challenges, and pressures that threatened everything I valued. In the days that followed, the tension seemed heavier than ever. Every time I stepped into my boyfriend's house, I felt an oppressive silence, his mother and sister watching my every move. The more I interacted with them, the clearer it became. Not everything would simply go away. His family wouldn't easily change, and I had to determine my own limits. One evening, he called me over to have an honest conversation. I entered the living room, which had once felt familiar, but now was thick with tension. He sat on the sofa, hands clasped, eyes fixed on the floor. as if preparing for an important discussion. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm, and he began, "You know I love you, but I'm afraid that standing with you will upset my family. I don't want to lose you, but I also don't want to damage my relationship with my mum and sister." I felt my chest tighten. This was the moment I had to decide: continue loving him under these complicated circumstances, or protect myself, my values, and my principles. I stepped closer, voice steady and firm. "You need to understand one thing. If you don't stand with me, if you choose to please your family over protecting our love and our values, I cannot continue. Love cannot be based on compromise or fear." He looked up, eyes swirling with worry and pain. We fell silent, listening to the quiet ticking of the clock, feeling as though the world waited for our decision. I realized no one could make this choice for me, and no one could force me to go against the values I held dear. Finally, he exhaled deeply, voice trembling but honest. I want to stand with you. I will try, even knowing it will be difficult. I cannot lose you, and I will learn to respect the values you hold." A wave of relief washed over me, but I knew the real challenge was only beginning. We still had to face his family, confront unresolved conflicts, but at least we were now standing together, both recognizing that love requires steadfastness and honesty. The next day, we met with his mother and sister, gone were the scrutinizing glances and mocking smiles. He stood beside me, holding my hand firmly. I looked at his mother. "I'm not asking you to change the past or forget everything, but I hope you can respect our love and the values I believe in." She was silent for a moment, then nodded lightly, voice subdued. "We will try." It wasn't complete acceptance, but it was the first step toward change. I felt the power of my inner strength and determination ripple through me, not just for myself, but also for the person I loved and his family. That evening, we sat together on the balcony, gazing at the city lights. He placed his hand over mine, voice low. "Thank you for standing firm. I know the road ahead will be challenging, but I'll try to walk it with you." I smiled, feeling a quiet peace, yet aware that love is a journey where steadfastness, honesty, and courage determine the strength of a relationship. We weren't perfect, and his family still had unresolved differences, but I knew that with our commitment to stand together, with honesty and inner strength, we had built a solid foundation for our love. I realized that sometimes love isn't just an emotion, it's a decision, a principle, and the courage to protect yourself and the person you love. As night fell, I looked into his eyes, heart filled with hope, though challenges remained. We were ready to face them together, ready to move forward side by side, and most importantly, no one could make me abandon my values or myself. Love had become a powerful journey, where only by standing together could we overcome every difficulty and trial life might throw at us.